That night, the Los Angeles sky felt like a heavy black blanket draped over the city, with faint streetlights casting dim glows on the quiet expanse of Sunset Boulevard. Keanu Reeves, with his signature unassuming demeanor, wore a worn leather jacket as he straddled his vintage motorcycle. He had just left a charity event supporting underprivileged children, a cause that always held a special place in his heart. Suddenly, the piercing sound of sirens shattered the stillness of the night. A police cruiser, flashing red and blue lights, sped up behind him, forcing Keanu to pull over to the curb. Calmly, he removed his helmet, revealing the familiar face known worldwide. But to Officer Jacob Carter, it didn't matter. Years of frustration, compounded by personal and professional struggles, had hardened him into a cold, cynical man weighed down by prejudice. "License and registration," Jacob barked, his voice sharp and cutting. Keanu, remarkably composed, extended his hand calmly, saying, "Here are my documents, sir." But instead of reviewing them, Jacob's eyes narrowed with suspicion, scanning every movement Keanu made as if he were searching for something incriminating. "Step out of the vehicle now," Jacob ordered, his tone icy and commanding. Keanu, maintaining his calm but firm voice, slowly complied, raising his hands to show he had no intentions of resistance. Yet this act of cooperation only seemed to intensify Jacob's unease. Years of prejudice and mounting pressure had culminated in this combustible moment. Jacob drew his weapon, aiming it directly at Keanu. For a brief moment, Keanu's breath caught, but his gaze remained unwavering. A cold breeze swept through, carrying the murmurs of worried onlookers who had begun to gather. Some raised their phones, capturing the unfolding scene, with the clicks of cameras and the glare of flashes adding chaos to the tension. "Officer, I'm unarmed. Let's talk this through," Keanu said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of concern. He could feel the tremor in Jacob's hands as the officer's gun stayed trained on him, and he saw the turmoil reflected in the man's eyes, a reflection of someone battling the weight of their own past. In that fleeting moment, time seemed to stop. Dozens of eyes were fixed on the scene, and countless questions raced through the minds of those watching. Why would someone like Keanu Reeves end up in such a situation? What made this officer so tense? No one could have predicted that this encounter would unravel into a story that would touch the deepest corners of every heart. The air on Sunset Boulevard was thick with tension. All eyes were fixed on Keanu and Jacob, as if the entire world held its breath, waiting for something to break. Jacob's hand clenched tightly around the trigger, his eyes blazing with anger. But if one looked closer, beneath that fury was the chaos of a tormented soul. "Put your hands where I can see them," Jacob shouted, his voice trembling, not just from the pressure of the moment, but from the storm raging within him. Keanu, still calm, followed the command without resistance. Yet, instead of easing Jacob's nerves, Keanu's composed demeanor only seemed to provoke him further, as if it was a silent challenge. The wail of another police car echoed in the distance. Within minutes, Jacob's superior officer and several colleagues arrived on the scene. "Carter, stand down!" The commanding voice cut through the night with finality. Jacob, unable to defy the order, reluctantly lowered his weapon, but the anger on his face remained etched deeply. Meanwhile, another officer quickly reviewed the footage from Jacob's body camera. The video captured the entire incident, and in mere moments, the verdict was clear. Jacob was stripped of his badge and weapon on the spot. "Carter, you're suspended effective immediately." The superior's voice delivered the blow, like a strike to Jacob's pride. Keanu, with his deep, penetrating gaze, stood silently, observing everything unfold. He offered no criticism, nor did he display any sign of anger. Yet, his quiet demeanor seemed to unsettle everyone present even more. How could someone who had just faced such danger remain so calm? That night, Jacob sat alone in his small apartment, surrounded by suffocating darkness. The pale glow of his phone illuminated his weary, tormented face. Headlines and images of the incident flooded the internet. Racist cop targets Keanu Reeves. The cost of prejudice. Keanu Reeves' dignified silence. Jacob scrolled through the comments, each one heavier than the last. This guy doesn't deserve to wear a badge. People like him are what's wrong with the system. Thank you, Keanu, for staying calm. It felt as though the entire world had turned against him. But the one thing Jacob couldn't shake was Keanu's serene face and quiet eyes. Why hadn't he reacted with anger? Why hadn't he retaliated? Jacob was restless, weighed down by confusion and exhaustion. He closed his eyes, but the image of Keanu's face lingered, stirring a strange yet distant sense of familiarity. It was like a puzzle piece he couldn't place, a fragment of a memory just out of reach. His chest tightened as an unexplainable unease began to take root, robbing him of sleep. In another part of the city, Keanu sat in his warm, modest home, the soft golden glow of a lamp casting a serene light over the space. In his hand, he held a letter, his eyes quiet but contemplative. Keanu said nothing, folding the letter carefully and setting it down on the table, as though preparing for something greater, a story the world had yet to uncover. The next morning, Jacob Carter woke up feeling drained. Pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, but it wasn't enough to lift the heaviness that had settled in his chest. The sound of knocking startled him. Reluctantly, he got up, an uneasy sensation stirring within him. At the door was an envelope, plain, white, and unmarked except for his name written in careful handwriting. Jacob Carter. With trembling hands, Jacob opened the letter. Each word etched itself into his mind, cutting through the fog of his thoughts. Jacob. Sometimes the pain we carry makes us act in ways we don't even recognize. I've been there too, fighting against darkness, searching for a way out. But one thing I've learned is that strength doesn't come from hiding the pain. It comes from facing it. I hope you find peace. Keanu. Jacob clutched the letter, his world seemingly crumbling beneath him. Why? Why would someone he had wronged so deeply, even threatened, write something so forgiving and kind? A storm of emotions welled up inside him, confusion, shame, and frustration at himself. Yet, above all, the letter planted a tiny seed of hope, like the first light of dawn breaking through a long, dark night. Jacob sat motionless in his chair, gripping the letter as though it were the most precious thing he owned. Yet within him, an unsettling restlessness clawed at his soul. His gaze fell on an old photo frame on the shelf, a picture of his family from years ago. Behind the glass were his wife Susan and his daughter Emma, both smiling brightly. The image brought back memories he had long buried. Keanu. That name sounds familiar, Jacob muttered, trying to piece together fragments of a memory buried deep in his mind. He stood, determined, and began rummaging through old boxes scattered around his small home. After hours of searching, Jacob unearthed a faded photo album. Page by page, memories flooded back, yet nothing felt concrete, until he stopped at one particular photo. It was Christmas, nearly a decade ago, in a hospital room. Susan sat on the hospital bed, cradling Emma in her arms. Both were smiling, a rare smile during an otherwise agonizing time. Standing beside them was a man with long black hair, holding a stack of gifts. Jacob sank to the floor, his heart constricting painfully. The man in the photo was Keanu. No, it can't be, Jacob whispered, his eyes welling with tears as the memories came rushing back like a tidal wave. 9 years earlier, on a freezing Christmas Eve, Susan had been battling cancer in the hospital. The medical bills were overwhelming, and Jacob felt like his world was falling apart. But that night, a stranger appeared, bringing gifts and an unexpected miracle. That man quietly paid all of Susan's medical expenses, giving the family one last Christmas together. Jacob clutched the photo, guilt overwhelming him. The very man he had treated with prejudice, the man he had pointed a gun at, was the one who had saved his family during their darkest hour. What have I done? Jacob's voice broke, trembling with remorse. The sky outside the window had turned dark, but within Jacob, A small spark began to flicker. He looked at Keanu's letter once more, this time absorbing every word with newfound clarity. Keanu hadn't just forgiven him, he had given Jacob a chance to confront himself. Jacob rose to his feet, his eyes filled with determination. "I need to see him," he said aloud, as if making a solemn vow to himself. Jacob's journey to redemption had officially begun. That night, the city's chill felt sharper than usual. Jacob Carter stepped out of his small apartment, his worn coat wrapped tightly around him. Keanu's letter, carefully folded, sat snugly in his pocket like a torch lighting his way. His heart pounded wildly, not from the cold, but from a mix of anxiety and determination surging within him. Jacob had no idea where to start. He didn't know Keanu's address or have any way of contacting him. But through a former colleague at the police department, he learned a rare piece of information. Keanu lived in a modest house on the outskirts of the city. The address was scribbled on a small slip of paper. Clutching it tightly, Jacob told himself this might be his one chance to confront his past. And himself. Jacob's old car rattled through the deserted streets. The streetlights flickered against the windshield, their reflections casting faint patterns. But Jacob's mind was consumed with swirling thoughts. What will I say? Will he forgive me? Or will I just make things worse? These questions gnawed at him relentlessly. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his gaze fixed ahead. Yet his heart felt like it was sinking into an ocean of turmoil. When he arrived, the small house emerged in the soft glow of golden light, far removed from the image of a grand, luxurious mansion he had imagined. This is where a famous actor lives? Jacob thought, but quickly realized how fitting it was for the man he had come to understand through quiet, selfless acts. Jacob approached the door, his hand trembling as he prepared to knock. His heart felt as though it was caught in a vice, squeezed by fear and regret. Before he could bring himself to knock, the door unexpectedly opened. There stood Keanu, dressed simply in a hoodie and worn jeans. His gaze was calm, yet deep and knowing. "Mr. Reeves, I'm sorry for showing up unannounced," Jacob stammered, his voice laced with unease. Keanu looked at him for a moment, then gently stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "Come in," Keanu said, his voice so steady and composed that it only deepened Jacob's discomfort. Inside, the home exuded warmth and intimacy. The shelves were lined with books, art adorned the walls, and a small wooden table held a steaming cup of tea. Jacob sat down, feeling as though he had entered a place where anger and resentment had no room to exist. Keanu sat across from him, his gaze fixed on Jacob, not with judgment, but with patient understanding. "I figured you'd come," Keanu said softly, his voice gentle yet disarming, as though stripping away the layers Jacob had built to shield himself. "You knew?" Jacob asked, his voice cracking with emotion. Keanu nodded slightly. "I saw it in your eyes that night. It wasn't just anger, it was pain. I've seen that look before, in my own reflection." Keanu's words pierced through the walls Jacob had built around himself, awakening emotions he had long suppressed. He lowered his head, his voice trembling. "I was wrong. I let my anger and pain turn me into someone I don't even recognize. I don't deserve forgiveness." Keanu interrupted, his gaze gentle yet resolute. "Forgiveness isn't about making someone deserving of it. Forgiveness is about letting go of the weight we carry. You've come here, facing it. That's the hardest part, but it's also the first step." Jacob's hands trembled as he reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph, the one of Keanu standing beside his family in the hospital. "You were there on that Christmas Eve. You helped my family when I couldn't, and I repaid you with injustice. How can I ever make this right?" Keanu looked at the photograph, a faint smile crossing his lips. "I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it was the right thing to do." The sincerity in Keanu's words broke through Jacob's defenses, and he could no longer hold back his tears. They streamed down his face. carrying with them years of regret and unspoken gratitude. "Thank you," Jacob managed to say between sobs, clutching the photograph as if it were a piece of memory he could never afford to lose. Keanu sat quietly, observing Jacob with a calm yet hopeful expression. "You can't change the past, Jacob, but you can do something better, starting today." As Jacob left the small house, he felt as though a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Keanu's words echoed in his mind. "You can't change the past, but you can change the future." For the first time in years, Jacob felt he had a chance, not to make amends with Keanu, but to heal the broken relationships in his own life. That night, as Jacob drove home, the city lights flickered past him like streams of memories flowing in reverse. Keanu's words lingered in his thoughts. Forgiveness isn't about making someone deserving. It's about letting go of the burden. It was the first time in years that Jacob felt he stood on the brink of real change, not just for redemption, but for rebuilding the fractured connections in his life. The next morning, Jacob stepped out of his house with a bouquet of flowers in hand and trembling fingers. He hadn't spoken to his daughter Emma in months. Ever since his wife Susan had passed, Jacob had drowned in his grief, shutting himself off from the world and pushing Emma away. But today, he resolved that it was time to make things right. Standing in front of Emma's house, Jacob's breathing grew heavy, and his legs felt as if they might betray him. He hesitated, but the memory of Susan's smile and Keanu's words gave him the courage to move forward. He knocked on the door, a soft but determined knock filled with hope. The door creaked open, and Emma stood there, her eyes widening in surprise. "Dad? What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tinged with both hesitation and curiosity. Jacob hesitated for a moment, his voice catching as he began. "Emma, I'm sorry. I failed you. I let my pain turn me into someone you couldn't recognize. And I hurt you, the one person I have left in this world. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to start again, if you'll let me." Emma looked at her father, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The resentment in her heart didn't vanish instantly, but she could see that her father was genuinely trying. "I missed you, Dad," Emma said softly before stepping forward and wrapping him in a tight embrace. That hug shattered the icy walls that had encased Jacob's heart for years. Tears flowed freely from both of them, mingling in a moment that required no words to convey its profound meaning. After the deeply emotional reunion with Emma, Jacob realized he couldn't stop at simply repairing his family ties. He needed to do something bigger, something meaningful, as both Susan and Keanu had encouraged him to do. Jacob resigned from the police department, a place that had once given him purpose, but now carried only heavy memories. He turned to a local youth outreach center, where teenagers faced struggles that mirrored those Jacob had often ignored in his career. For the first time, Jacob stood before a group of teenagers, kids burdened with pain and anger, just as he once had been. Taking a deep breath, he began sharing his story, unflinchingly exposing his mistakes and the darker moments of his life. "You know," he started, "sometimes the pain we carry makes us do things we regret. I used to think I was strong by holding everything inside, by letting anger control me. But I've learned that true strength comes from having the courage to face it and make a change." The kids' guarded eyes began to soften. Questions followed, then stories. Slowly, Jacob felt that he was making a difference. For the first time in years, a sense of lightness returned to his heart. One evening, after a long day at the center, Jacob received a call from Emma. "Dad, I found something while going through Mom's things," Emma said, her voice tinged with emotion. "It's a letter she wrote to you." Jacob nearly dropped the phone. When the letter arrived, he held it with trembling hands. Carefully opening the envelope, he saw Susan's handwriting, clear and unmistakable. "Mark, if you're reading this, I'm probably no longer here, but I want you to know that I've always believed in you, even when you didn't believe in yourself. I know the pain you carry is heavy, but don't let it consume you. Live for the good things. Do what you know is right. I believe in you, Mark, just as I always have since the beginning. Forever yours, Susan. Jacob sank into his chair, tears streaming down his face. Susan's final words were like a powerful beacon, reminding him that his journey wasn't just about seeking redemption, but also about continuing the dream his wife had always envisioned for him. Folding the letter carefully, Jacob placed it in a box alongside Susan's keepsakes. The weight of his past no longer haunted him. Instead, he felt a profound sense of peace and determination. He wasn't just living for himself anymore. He was living for the love, hope, and faith Susan had always held for him. Jacob's journey continued, but this time, he wasn't walking it alone. He carried Susan's love, Keanu's forgiveness, and the hope inspired by the youth he was now helping. Life began to settle into a rhythm for Jacob. His days at the Youth Outreach Center brought him a sense of purpose and peace that he hadn't felt in years. Each day, he listened to the stories of the kids he worked with, shared in their struggles, and found that by helping them, he was also healing himself. One quiet evening, the ringing of Jacob's phone broke the stillness. On the other end was a familiar, warm, and steady voice. "Jacob, it's Keanu. I've been thinking a lot about our conversation." Keanu began, his tone calm but tinged with hesitation. "There's something I need to tell you. It's not easy, but I think you should know the truth." Jacob sat upright, his heart racing. "What is it, Keanu?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Keanu took a deep breath before speaking. "On that Christmas Eve when I was at the hospital helping your family, I wasn't just there to help others. I was going through my own pain. My younger sister, Kim, was battling leukemia. I came to the hospital to be with her, bringing gifts in the hope that they might make her smile, even if only for a moment." Jacob felt the breath leave his lungs. He sat in stunned silence, unable to fathom that Keanu, the man who had stood by his family during their darkest days, had been enduring his own profound loss. "Keanu, I don't know what to say," Jacob stammered, his voice breaking. Keanu continued, his tone reflective. "That night, when I saw Susan and Emma smiling together despite the difficulty of their situation, it reminded me why I was there. Their love and resilience showed me that even in pain, there is light. Though my sister didn't survive, I've carried the image of your family with me ever since, as a reminder of the strength of love and hope." Jacob was speechless. Keanu's words didn't just evoke painful memories but also a deep sense of shared understanding. Two men, from vastly different circumstances, were bound by a connection they never anticipated: loss and hope. The conversation left a profound impact on Jacob, propelling him to do even more. He realized that his journey of redemption wasn't just about fixing past mistakes. It was about spreading the kindness that had once saved him. Jacob decided to organize a large seminar at the youth center. He invited Keanu to attend, not only to thank him, but also to inspire others. The seminar took place in a small meeting hall, filled not with grandeur, but with sincerity. Jacob stood at the podium, sharing his story, from the mistakes he had made to the journey of finding himself again. "I used to think that when we make mistakes, we're no longer worthy of good things. But thanks to one man, I learned that forgiveness isn't about freeing someone else. It's about freeing ourselves." As Jacob finished, Keanu stepped up to the stage. He didn't say much, but what he did share resonated deeply. "The love I saw in Mark's family that Christmas helped me endure my own pain. And today, I see that same love and resilience, not just in Mark, but in all of you here. Even the smallest kindness can change a life." The room was silent, but moments later, a wave of applause erupted, as if to chase away every lingering shadow. After the seminar, Jacob and Keanu stood together in the golden glow of the setting sun. Jacob turned to him and said, Thank you, Keanu. Not just for what you did for my family, but for showing me that there's always hope, even in the darkest days. Keanu smiled, his eyes filled with sincerity. Jacob, I was just a small part of your journey. The important thing is that you chose to change, and that's something no one else can do for you. When Jacob returned home, he wrote a letter to Susan and placed it in her keepsake box. In it, he wrote, Susan, you always believed in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself. Today, I found the light you once spoke of. I will continue to spread it. For you, for Emma, and for everyone who has ever believed in kindness. Forever yours, Jacob. Closing the box, Jacob looked up at the night sky, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a new journey. A journey to live with compassion, hope, and forgiveness. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the curtains, filling Jacob's small room with warmth. It was a new day, but for Jacob, it felt like an entirely new life. In his heart was a quiet joy, a sense of purpose and peace he thought he had lost forever. He carefully took Susan's keepsake box, opened it, and reread her letter. Her words echoed in his mind like an eternal reminder. Live for the good things. Jacob stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. Today, he wasn't the man weighed down by the past. He was a father, a mentor, and a man ready to move forward, not just for himself, but for those he loved and those who needed him. Jacob drove to Emma's house with a bouquet of fresh flowers and a gentle smile. She stood on the porch, her smile mirroring Susan's, a smile Jacob never thought he'd see again. Good morning, sweetheart, he greeted her warmly. Emma wrapped her arms tightly around him, needing no words, no explanation. In that moment, there was only love. Their simple dinners together became a cherished routine filled with laughter and stories. Through each conversation, they pieced back together the fragments of their once fractured family. One afternoon, after returning home from a long day at the youth center, Jacob found a package waiting on his doorstep. His name was written on it in Keanu's familiar handwriting. Opening the box, Jacob found a book titled Kindness, Stories That Change Lives. Inside the cover was a handwritten note. Jacob, even the smallest acts of kindness can create profound change. You've shown that anyone can find the light and share it with others. Keep doing good, because the world needs more people like you. Keanu. Jacob smiled, his heart warmed by the gesture. He placed the book on his shelf, letting it serve as a constant reminder that his journey wasn't just about righting past wrongs, but about living a life of compassion and spreading that kindness to others. Jacob returned to the youth center, where the kids were gathered to hear him speak. Standing on the stage, his voice was steady but filled with passion. I used to believe that I couldn't change, that my mistakes would haunt me forever. But I've learned that even in the darkest days, if we face our failures and choose to change, the light will find us. Applause filled the room, but Jacob didn't just see raised hands. He saw bright eyes, glimmers of hope ignited in the young faces before him. Hope like the kind Keanu had once given him. In the golden glow of sunset, Jacob stood outside the youth center, looking up at the sky. The amber sunlight embraced him, bridging his past and present. In his hands were Susan's letter and Keanu's book, and in his eyes shone determination and hope. Jacob smiled softly and whispered, I'll keep going, Susan. I'll keep making you proud. In the distance, a child stepped out of the center and waved at him. Jacob waved back, his heart filled with the certainty that no matter how challenging his journey might be, every small act of kindness could create miracles. And he knew that from this moment on, he was no longer walking alone. Kindness doesn't just change the life of the receiver. It brings light to the giver as well. Each of us can be a source of inspiration, as long as we're willing to begin. Spread kindness. If this story touched your heart, share it to spread the message of forgiveness, compassion, and hope. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Your Story, to experience more meaningful and inspiring stories.